Something unexpected has been happening in the culture. After centuries of moving towards secularism, it's becoming cool to be religious again. Now, the quantifiable stats don't reflect this just yet. As of now, more people in the United States identify as atheists than ever before. But as we'll explore in this episode, changes in the dominant belief system of a culture always precede changes in mass behavior. And we are going to see in this next generation, I predict, a lot more people, a lot more young people coming back or converting towards monotheistic religions. So I believe we are in a cultural inflection point. We're going to see some changes in behaviors, some shifts in the Overton window, specifically around a religion, specifically around monotheistic religion. So to be clear, I'm definitely not trying to convince anyone to find God here. I'm probably more agnostic than anything still. Personally, I was raised both Catholic and Buddhist at the same time, and as you would imagine, those two ideologies contradict each other quite a bit. So in my teenage years, I became a pretty militant atheist. Then in my 20s, for reasons of searching for meaning that were also discussed here, I tried on various alternative forms of spirituality, only now to come in my mid-30s, perhaps due to life situation, for the first time in my life, really interested in traditional conservative religion. So perhaps ironically, we're going to look at spirituality from a very rational, psychocultural perspective. And I think it's particularly relevant for anyone really interested in their personal development, because the fact is there are certain things that spirituality does for us that you can't really get in any other kind of personal development modality. And these are the reasons why monotheism is making a comeback. When Nietzsche said God is dead, he was referring to that for the first time in human history, our day-to-day life, our conscious map of how we navigate reality was detaching from a spiritual worldview. Obviously for him in Europe, this was the Christian worldview that has been the backbone of Western society for most of its existence. But really, it was a marker in all of human civilization has been bound by some sort of spiritual framework, some sort of moral framework, most derived from religion. So one simple way to look at this from a cognitive perspective is that there is the material world around us, right? It's the stuff that we can assume without getting trippy is just objectively there. We take it in through our five senses, but we don't interact with that directly, not all the time. In fact, in this moment, presumably you're paying attention to a video, your attention is not on the tons of sensory data that you are now filtering out, right? The peripheral sights and sounds, the feelings in your body, right? Unless we turn this into a guided meditation, you're probably not paying attention to your breathing or a heartbeat or, gravity on your body. All of these things get filtered out. Even with the stuff that you do pay attention to, you're not taking in all of it because you just don't have the bandwidth for all of it. You reduce it down to what is relevant, right? So like when you drive, for instance, you're not processing the make and model of every car. You're abstracting it down to other vehicle, right? You don't drive into other vehicles. And as long as they're doing what you expect them to do, following traffic laws, in your conscious mind, they're just an abstract vehicle with no features because you don't care. You don't need those details. Only if some other car does something weird that you have to pay attention, does it come into focus. You're like, oh, that red Camry is about to cross a light. This is how we navigate reality. Now, human beings have infinite ways of abstracting concrete, material, objective reality down to what's relevant. For instance, two people might abstract a cow, which is a real thing, into two totally different meanings, right? To a meat eater, a cow is future hamburgers. To a PETA activist, a cow is a protected group, right? Two totally different meanings, two different abstract ways of interacting with the same material thing. Now, if you have a society of all of these free-thinking, conscious individuals with totally different maps of reality, it's very unlikely they'll get along. It's very unlikely they'll be able to work together, which is, of course, an absolutely important thing for a social animal, such as a human. So humans developed culture, developed perception of morality as a way to basically get everyone on the same page for the most part, right? Especially when it comes to morality, right? Morality is the part of our map of reality that says what's right and what's wrong. If at a baseline level, all of us in a given tribe, in a given society can agree what is right and what is wrong, we can basically work together. We're basically going to be on the same page, as opposed to if you look at what's going on in the culture wars right now, a lot of what's infuriating to both sides, to everyone, to bystanders, is this disagreement over basically right and wrong, which seems like it should be just a given thing, but obviously morality is subjective. So for most of human history, or most of the time that humans have been conscious and organizing in groups, religion, spirituality was this all-encompassing map that not only told us how to abstract meaning from what's going on, basically explaining the ball in the sky, the seasons, all of these things through mythology, through story. It also told us what was right and what was wrong. It also was a map that came with directions, right? An ideology, whether it's seen as religious or any of the, you could look at modern ideologies that seem secular, but they're basically religions. They gamify reality for you, right? They give you a map that makes your life kind of like an RPG where, even though obviously we don't think of this consciously, it becomes very clear if you're part of a certain culture and a certain society with a clear moral framework. It becomes very clear what scores you points, so to speak, in the group, right? What will give you validation, what will give you positive feedback, what will make you successful and happy in that given society as laid out by the culture. So for instance, something very relevant in the men's personal development space is what map of relating to women does a young boy get, right? The typical beta male nice guy grew up with a map that told him the way to score points with women, the way to be liked is to be super subservient, beta, whatever, right? Whereas, a natural alpha, someone who was, say red-pilled early on, was given a map of, no, the way to be liked by women is to be dominant, is to be assertive, all these other things, right? Counter to that. They were both, if it was given to a boy as a child, both were just following the maps, right? One map was wrong and led to the wrong results. The other map was, for the most part, right, at least when it comes to the result they were looking for. The religions that caught on in early times were ones that, whether or not they had a good explanation for reality, they had a good story, and that story led to behaviors that people wanted, that led to them to results that they wanted to have, right? They were successful. Their tribe survived, right? I speak about this in the History of Man podcast, where honor was a basic meme that had to evolve in any group, because any group that didn't evolve the moral of honor, the men wouldn't stick around to defend the women and children if they got attacked. So those were wiped out quickly. The only groups that survived were ones where men had they evolved to have some sort of perception of honor. So just as it's impossible for an individual to navigate reality without some sort of map that gives him meaning, tells him what's relevant, it's impossible for a society to function without some sort of dominant ideology that for the most part guides people into similar behaviors. Because the only way that we can confirm our perceptions of reality is through other people, right? If you see a bird in the sky and your friend sees a bird in the sky, you know that you're not insane. You know that you are perceiving reality properly. Whereas if your friend doesn't see the bird in the sky, one of you is insane. So when Nietzsche declared that God was dead, he was saying that the dominant belief system of society was no longer based in religion, specifically Christianity. It was being replaced by what we could in general refer to as modernity. Modernity is, of course, made up of many different isms. We can call it consumerism. There's many other isms you can probably think of, many sub-ideologies. But in general, all of us, regardless of your belief system, are subject to the dominant belief systems of culture, because it seems like water to a fish, right? Anyone who lives in society believes that money is important. Whether you're striving for money, or even if you think money is the root of all evil, you still, down at your core, believe it's important because to exist in modern society, you need it. Now, modernity replaced religion as the dominant map of society, for a few reasons. The big one being that as science and technology progressed, it was able to prove some things wrong about the Christian map, let's say. And even if you're a devout Christian, obviously you have to admit that there are some things wrong in the Bible as far as, how old the earth is and, the structure of the solar system and things like that, which, if those men who wrote the Bible actually got right, that would have been a miracle, right? Because they didn't have the technology back then. They basically came up with stories that were very good guiding principles for people to live. And they had to explain certain things, but they couldn't get it right. But it worked as a story back then because no one could disprove it. But once people in the modern age were able to disprove it, many people were starting to think, well, maybe let's throw out the map. Which does kind of make sense, right? If a map has things incorrect on it, maybe you don't want to use that map to navigate your life. The other side of it is, as technology advanced, it made people's lives more comfortable, or at least guaranteed more material survival, right? If you look at a modern city in a developed nation, like in New York City, even homeless people have a place to charge their phones and get on the Wi-Fi, right? Even as someone who lives a very unenviable, materially poor existence, still has access to certain material resources that most human beings through most of human existence did not have access to. So if you live in a developed society, a state that takes care of you materially, either by providing you with resources you wouldn't have had, or taking care of security, the borders are secure, peace is for the most part taken care of in your neighborhood, maybe the need for a spiritual framework isn't as dire as it was for our ancestors, right? Most of us in a developed nation, we're not interacting with society directly. We're getting our food from a supermarket, from the supply chain. The structure of society is taking care of our baseline material needs. And therefore, the evolved reason for spirituality, which is to help us navigate the craziness of real life in nature, is not as necessary as it was before. But we still evolved to follow some sort of spiritual map and then get a material reward. To get the material reward up front, this is going to seem like a weird analogy, but it's kind of like internet pornography, whereas, it's so addicting to men, especially young men, because we're wired to chase those images to get the rewards of procreation, kind of like what pharmaceutical companies do with taking the active compound out of a plant, let's say. Pornography takes out this one little thing, this particular image that's supposed to lead us into the human mating ritual, but instead isolates it, puts it on a screen, gets guys addicted, hitting the dopamine button. You guys know how that goes. In a more far-reaching and also subtle way, modernity offers us the end rewards, the material rewards of following a spiritual map without the spiritual map, right? We miss out on some of the process of, the hunt for fulfillment, so to speak. Which is why, while it feels really good to buy stuff on Amazon or wherever, it doesn't actually lead to happiness. While the map of modernity is great for giving certain material results, it is not a good map for navigating some experiences that are core to human fulfillment, such as having a family. Now, I can't prove this, but I do believe that one of the reasons why religion is making a comeback is that millennials, the first generation to grow up with the internet and this kind of cultural exchange, are at childbearing years, right? We're in our mid-30s. Some of us are running for president. We're at an age now where we're making decisions less based on a more adolescent mindset. And having a family, modernity does not help with that. The debate I often see amongst my friends thinking about having kids is in a very modernist lens, a consumerist lens. One argument against it is that it is really expensive to have children. That is true. Consumerism, in a sense, punishes you, not in a sense, actually pretty literally punishes you for wanting to have children, for wanting to have more children, especially if you live in a city where consumerism is really the dominant ideology. You get heavily punished for having children. And you don't have to get too conspiratorial to see that if a couple has children, they now have a source of fulfillment that doesn't at least directly cost them anything, right? They're becoming less of a good consumer who is maybe susceptible to spending their dollars on experiences that'll make them feel good. And on the other side of the equation, I hear the argument that, the reason to have kids is that you need someone to take care of you when you're old, which is another way of reducing it down to a dollar value, right? That is not the reason to have children. In fact, if that's your reason, if anyone I know who says that is like, well, you might as well just save your money and hire a nurse when you're old, because the reason to have children is not something that can be quantified, certainly not in dollars. And when you see cultures that try to do this in an even more extreme way, like if you look at Japan, where so many things, so many aspects of human connection have been broken down into a service that you can pay for, you also see that suicide rates are the highest in that society. It is not a coincidence. So despite the errors in the religious maps of reality, here's where religion have major advantages over modernity, because they specifically give you a framework that works really well with having a family. And this goes beyond just your religious community rewarding you for having kids and everyone else has lots of kids and God loves children. There's memes like that. But also, it's a framework that fits the family life. And this is, I think, a specific advantage of monotheistic religion. Because if you look back at the earliest religions, the animist, shamanistic religions, back then when those religions were created, human society wasn't very complex. Human social life wasn't very complex. Every individual largely interacted with nature directly, which is why their spiritual map of reality, their early religions, could be pretty simple by modern standards. Okay, the tree has a tree spirit, the sky has a sky spirit, we have some stories about it. You prayed almost directly to the spirit, right? Of the thing, of the plant, of the type of animal. Whereas as human society became more complex, you see the rise of polytheistic religions, where now instead of a tree spirit or a rock spirit or a river spirit, now you have a goddess of the woods, or you have a deity to represent certain more abstract parts of human life that are really important, such as the concept of fertility, right? There's no physical thing like a rock or a tree that is fertility. Fertility is a concept that is very meaningful in human society, just like war, just like love, just like wisdom. And polytheistic religions had to create, or they evolved to create, their spiritual framework based on what is particularly relevant in human society. But then comes in monotheism. And James Hillman, a Jungian psychologist, wrote a great essay on how the polytheistic view of reality kind of corresponds to Jungian archetypes, whereas the monotheistic view of reality is kind of similar to the Freudian view in psychology. And even though Freud was an atheist, Hillman argued that because he grew up in Vienna in a Christian society, he couldn't help having a view of reality that was monotheistic. Like if you look at Freud's id, ego, superego, it is oddly reminiscent of the Holy Trinity. There's this baseline assumption that the human mind should somehow be unified as a single thing, maybe with three parts. Whereas if you look at someone who grew up in a polytheistic society, Jungian archetypes would probably make a lot more sense. It's like, oh yeah, there's all these different forces, just like there's all these different gods around us. Now, monotheistic religions caught on for a few reasons, but one being that there is one God. There is God the Father, right? The Abrahamic religions are all patriarchal religions. There is a father in the sky, which I think just that framework better fit societies where there was enforced monogamy, where the nuclear family was normalized, right? A family has a father, the kids look up to the father, the physical father for protection and provisions, whereas the family as a whole, the nation as a whole looks up to God the Father in the sky. It matches our lived experience of family life a lot better than a lot of other religions. And this is one interesting thing about growing up both Buddhist and Catholic is that even though Buddhism definitely doesn't follow this framework at all, amongst devout Buddhists, there's still this tendency to turn him into a patriarch, right? Referring to him as Lord Buddha. Actually, the ancient writings say that he did not want himself turned into an idol or any, images created of him. In Theravada Buddhism, the typical structure is a stupa, which is just a round dome bearing no resemblance to a person. But of course, if you look anywhere, you'll see, images created of the Buddha because, for the ideology to be marketable, to be palatable to the average person living a normal life, they want to have a physical image of somebody, right? Actually, fun fact, there were no carvings or stone statues of Buddha until Alexander the Great's army made its way into India, and they took their Greek habit or their cultural tendency to make carvings of their gods, and they started carving statues of Buddha, and that eventually caught on through the rest of the subcontinent. Which brings us to perhaps the only argument I'll actually make to someone on why they should consider spirituality, and specifically a traditional religion, is that the ancient Greeks, and many cultures, but let's go with the Greeks, believed that in key moments in a person's life, in war, in childbirth, in hunting, in things that really mattered, the gods would visit you. And if you were in the gods' favor, they would give you powers and ability and courage and physical strength that you didn't have before. If you were not in the gods' favor, they would incept you with basically spells that would make you feel bad. Actually, the term panic comes from the god Pan. It was believed by the ancient Greeks that if Pan didn't like you, he could cast a spell on your army and cause everyone to feel intense fear that they wouldn't have had normally. Now, of course, we know this can all be tracked biologically through hormones in battle. Men have surges of adrenaline and noradrenaline and testosterone, and this is what caused that euphoric or dysphoric feeling, the altered states of consciousness, the added abilities. But believing a god was visiting you was just as good. Alexander would sacrifice to the gods before every battle and after taking a city, in which he attributed to part of his success. And an atheist might say, oh, that's just placebo effect. He's tricking himself into feeling like he deserves to win or something like that. But what difference does it make, right? The Islamic army, Muhammad's first army, was able to defeat way more advanced armies using Stone Age fighting techniques because the men were armed with something much better. They were armed in a strong belief that carried them all the way through campaigns through North Africa into Europe, and they're only stopped by a Christian army also fueled by ideals. Because even though parts of religious or spiritual maps maybe don't line up so much with a modern world, when it comes to moments that really count, moments where you have to dig deep, where you have to draw on internal human resources that you can't just absorb through a pill or reading a self-help book, religion, a strong belief in something, a belief in something bigger than you that is not subject to your changes in perceptions or identity day to day, it gives you real, tangible abilities that you wouldn't have had otherwise. They say there's no atheists in foxholes because we know on some primal level that if we want to get out of that foxhole and survive the battle, we have to draw on something bigger than our own ego. Now, you hear people finding religion a lot after a very difficult time in their life or some challenge or some crisis befalls them. But I think in general as a culture, even for people who might not have some acute malady in their life, the general move away from meaning, away from a map that actually works for our livable life, that fulfills us with material rewards without giving us a spiritual journey to earn it, is giving the general population, a lot of people, even intellectuals who historically have been atheists, at least since the Enlightenment, it's giving a certain appeal to look at these ancient, tried and true systems, which yes, may be oppressive in some ways. Yes, they have certain things wrong on their map, but it's actually giving you something that you can't really get anywhere else. So again, not trying to convince anyone to find God. At this moment, I do not subscribe to any particular religion, but there is a reason, especially for someone interested in their personal development, to want to get the most out of life. There is a reason to look at things that are not material. Things that won't give you a clear ROI, but will give you a level of fulfillment and satisfaction and a map of reality of navigating real life that you can't get anywhere else. Science gives us the best and most accurate map for explaining objective reality, but doesn't really give us a living framework about how to navigate our lives. Modernity gives you a framework to basically collect dollars and transact them for experiences, but it doesn't touch certain realms of human experience that are fundamental to fulfillment. Nietzsche was kind of right that modern Western society probably never again will have a unified map of reality based in a spiritual framework. And as we can see with the culture wars, people are able to look at each other's maps and ridicule each other's maps and point out holes in each other's maps. But we all need a map. And ancient religions, despite the errors in parts of the map, offer us something that other ideological maps do not. And that is why monotheism is making a comeback. At least that's what I believe. Goodbye.